The rain in November had a way of washing the color from the city, leaving behind a slick, monochrome world of asphalt and concrete that reflected the jaundiced glow of the streetlights. Detective Michael Harrington stood under the failing vinyl awning of a pawn shop, the collar of his trench coat turned up against the biting wind. The smell of wet garbage and exhaust fumes was the city's official perfume. Across the street, the crime scene was a chaotic ballet of flashing blue and red lights, uniformed officers, and yellow tape that sagged under the weight of the downpour. This was the third one. The third meticulously arranged tableau of violence that left no answers, only a chilling, repeating signature. Harrington took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember a lone point of warmth in the cold night. His gut, a place where old cases went to die and fester, was churning with a familiar dread. It was the feeling of being watched, of being played with by an unseen intelligence. He finally crossed the street, ducking under the tape. A young officer, his face pale and slick with rain, nodded nervously. "Detective, he did it again." Harrington didn't need the confirmation. He could feel it in the air, a kind of sterile order imposed upon brutal chaos. Inside the small second-floor apartment, the forensics team moved with practiced quiet. The victim, a university librarian named Arthur Gable, was seated in a leather armchair, facing a dormant television screen. There was no sign of a struggle. The cause of death was a single, precise wound, but that wasn't the focus. It was everything else. On the wall opposite him, a perfect spiral was drawn in what appeared to be ink, its lines impossibly steady. A single black rook chess piece was placed on the floor at the exact center of the room. And on a small end table, a page torn from a book of poetry was left beside a cooled cup of tea. It was the same pattern as before. The spiral, the chess piece, the poetry. A different poem each time, a different piece. A knight, then a bishop, now a rook. But the ritual was unmistakable. "Anything?" Harrington's voice was a low rasp, worn down by years of sleepless nights and too much nicotine. A forensics tech shook his head, frustration etched on his face. "Wiped clean, Mike. It's like a ghost was here. No prints, no fibers, no hair, nothing. It's impossible." Harrington knelt, his aging knees protesting, and looked at the page of poetry. "It was Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." The irony was as thick as the humid air in the room. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Claire Donovan, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was young, barely out of the academy, and assigned to the forensics analysis unit. In the department of grizzled, cynical men, she was an anomaly of bright-eyed idealism and fierce intelligence. Most of the old guard dismissed her as a kid playing with computers, but Harrington had seen the way her mind worked, the way she saw connections that everyone else missed. "The book it was torn from is on the shelf," she said, her voice soft but clear, pointing a gloved finger towards a meticulously organized bookcase. "He didn't bring it with him. He used what was already here. Same as the other two scenes, he integrates the victim's life into the pattern." Harrington stood up, looking from the victim to Claire. "He's not just killing them, he's curating them. He's telling a story," she corrected gently. "And we're the intended audience." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was a toxic mix of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and despair. The case was already a media sensation, dubbed the Poet Killer by a headline-hungry press. On a large corkboard, photos of the three victims stared out, their faces frozen in time. Below them were photos of the spirals, the chess pieces, the poems. It was a gallery of madness. Harrington stared at the board, feeling the weight of the city's fear on his shoulders. This was the kind of case that broke careers. It reminded him too much of the O'Connell case from 5 years ago, a kidnapping that went cold, a child never found, a failure that haunted his every waking moment. He couldn't let this become another ghost. Claire approached him, holding a folder. "I've been running cross-references on the victims. On the surface, they're random. a retired dock worker, a music teacher, and now a librarian. Different ages, races, neighborhoods, no obvious connection. There's always a connection, Harrington grumbled, not taking his eyes off the board. I know, but it's not in their financials, their phone records, or their daily routines. The link is more abstract. She paused, gathering her thoughts. All three were quiet people, reclusive even. Gable barely left his apartment outside of work. The music teacher was a widow with no children. The dock worker was estranged from his family. They were all, in a way, isolated, people who wouldn't be missed right away. Harrington turned to her, a flicker of interest in his tired eyes. He's choosing victims who live in the margins. It gives him time, Claire concluded. More time between the act and the discovery. It shows a high level of planning and patience. He's not impulsive. He stared at her, then back at the board. The pattern was a language, and Claire was the only one who seemed to be trying to translate it instead of just staring at the words. The skepticism he saw on the faces of his colleagues when she spoke was a familiar obstacle, one she constantly had to overcome. But as he looked at the maddeningly perfect spirals and the silent, mocking chess pieces, he knew her analytical mind was their only real weapon against a killer who was more architect than butcher. The old ways, the shoe-leather detective work, the hunches, the intimidation tactics, were useless against a phantom. They knew the pattern, every elegant and terrifying detail of it. But the face behind it remained lost in the shadows, a ghost moving through their city, and Harrington knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would be leaving another calling card very soon. 2 weeks later, the city was holding its breath, and the rain had given way to a brittle grey cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the buildings. The poet-killer had fallen silent, and the absence of a new crime was almost as unnerving as the crimes themselves. The lull gave the media a vacuum to fill with speculation and fear, and the pressure on the department, and on Harrington specifically, was mounting to an unbearable level. Every day, the police chief's face grew a little tighter, his questions a little sharper. Harrington found himself living at the precinct, surviving on vending machine sandwiches and the bitter brew he called coffee. The case files were his only companions through the long nights, the faces of the victims silently judging him from the corkboard. It was during this tense quiet that the dynamic between Harrington and Claire began to shift. While most detectives saw the silence as a sign the killer had moved on or gone to ground, Claire saw it as part of the pattern itself. She spent her days in the sterile, humming environment of the forensics lab, surrounded by the nascent technology of the 1990s. While others were waiting for a fingerprint or a witness, she was building what she called a behavioral echo of the killer, inputting every detail of the crime scenes into a rudimentary database, trying to force the machine to see what the human eye could not. "He's observing," she said one afternoon, standing before Harrington's cluttered desk. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. The media coverage, the police response. This silence isn't a pause. It's an intermission. He's watching the effect of his work, the poems he chooses. They're all about mortality and legacy. He sees himself as an artist, and he's waiting for the reviews. Harrington grunted, lighting another cigarette. An artist? He's a ghoul, Claire. To us, yes, but not to himself, she insisted, her youthful earnestness a stark contrast to his weary cynicism. If we want to catch him, we have to think like him. We have to stop looking for a motive in the traditional sense, like money or revenge, and start looking for an artistic one, a statement. Her theory was met with open derision in the next briefing. Detective Miller, a portly veteran with a mustache and a permanent scowl, actually laughed. An artist? For crying out loud, Donovan, he's a whack job putting chess pieces in apartments. Let's stick to real police work, huh? Can your computer tell us where he buys his ink? Claire's face flushed, but she stood her ground. The ink is a standard, commercially available brand, Detective. Untraceable. The chess pieces are from a common, mass-produced set. also untraceable. The only unique thing we have is his behavior. The pattern, that is the evidence." Harrington watched the exchange, a familiar anger simmering in his chest. He saw the condescension in Miller's eyes, the casual dismissal. It was how they treated anyone who didn't fit their mold. He cleared his throat, and the room fell quiet. "She has a point," he said, his voice low but carrying weight. "Everything we've done so far, the real police work, has gotten us exactly nowhere, so for now we listen to her." He looked directly at Claire, a silent affirmation that was not lost on her. For the first time, she felt like more than just a lab tech. She felt like a partner. The fourth victim was found 3 days later, a reclusive stamp collector in a quiet, suburban part of the city they hadn't been watching. The pattern was the same, yet different. The spiral on the wall was tighter, more intricate. The chess piece was a queen, placed directly in the victim's hand, and the poem from Poe was chillingly direct. "And all my soul within me burning." It felt like a message, a taunt aimed directly at the investigation. The killer knew they were watching. He was evolving. He was escalating. The new scene sent a wave of panic through the department, but for Claire, it provided a crucial piece of data. She stayed in the lab for 36 hours straight, fueled by coffee and a burning intensity. Harrington found her there, asleep at her keyboard, the screen filled with maps and charts. He gently woke her. She blinked, disoriented, then her eyes lit up with discovery. "The locations, Mike. I was wrong. They're not random at all." She pointed to a map on the screen, where the 4 crime scenes were marked with red dots. "I've been looking at them geographically, but that was the mistake. It's not about where they are, it's about the lines between them." With a few keystrokes, she drew lines connecting the dots in the order of the murders. The shape that emerged was crude but unmistakable, the beginnings of a spiral. "My God," Harrington whispered, leaning closer. "He's not just drawing them on the walls. He's drawing one on the city itself." Claire nodded, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and excitement. "And if the pattern holds, if he's making a perfect spiral, I can predict the general area where he'll strike next." She zoomed in on a neighborhood on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place of abandoned warehouses and forgotten docks. It was a bleak, desolate area, the perfect hunting ground. The psychological game had just taken a sharp, terrifying turn. The killer wasn't just leaving a signature. He was creating a masterpiece of madness across the city's map. He was an artist, just as Claire had said. But now, for the first time, they had a glimpse of his canvas. They had a direction. And as Harrington looked at the exhausted but triumphant young analyst beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sliver of hope. He was still chasing a ghost, but now he knew where the ghost was going to appear next. The weight of Claire's discovery settled over the task force, transforming the precinct from a morgue of despair into a hive of tense, focused activity. The industrial district she had identified, a sprawling, decaying labyrinth of brick and rusted steel along the riverfront, became their entire world. For Harrington, it was a return to the fundamentals of detective work, but now guided by Claire's modern analytical mind. They had a map, a theory, a ghost of a chance. They spent days canvassing the area, the biting wind whipping off the river, their faces raw from the cold. They interviewed the handful of people who still lived or worked there, weary factory workers, suspicious squatters, grizzled old men who'd spent their lives on the docks. It was a place of forgotten people, the exact type the killer seemed to favor. The 1990s technology, their supposed ally, showed its limitations at every turn. Database searches for residents with specific psychological profiles took days to process. There was no citywide CCTV network to tap into, no GPS to track. Their investigation was a frustrating crawl through mountains of paper records, relying on hunches and the slow, grinding work of knocking on doors. Miller and the other old guard detectives grew impatient, their skepticism about Claire's spiral theory returning with a vengeance. "We're chasing our tails out here, Mike," Miller complained during one freezing stakeout, his breath pluming in the air. "This is a wild goose chase based on a doodle on a map." Harrington, however, held firm. His trust in Claire's insight had solidified into a quiet conviction. He saw the logic, the cold, terrifying poetry of the killer's plan. He was learning to listen to her, to trust a different kind of instinct than his own, one based on data and patterns rather than gut feelings alone. It was a humbling experience for a man used to being the smartest person in the room. Their break came not from a computer, but from a simple human observation. Claire, poring over old city archives, found a detail no one else would have thought to look for. Several of the abandoned warehouses in their target zone had been part of a municipal arts project in the late 70s, briefly converted into subsidized studios for aspiring artists before the funding was cut. "He sees himself as an artist," she reminded Harrington, her voice urgent over the phone. "Maybe he has a history here, a connection to this place." They focused their search on a list of artists who had rented those spaces. It was a long shot, a 20-year-old list of transient, often untraceable people. But it was a lead, a tangible thread. As they cross-referenced the names with public records, one jumped out, a man named Alistair Finch, a painter known for his obsessively detailed geometric work, primarily spirals. He had a minor criminal record for disorderly conduct and had been institutionalized for a short period a decade ago after a public breakdown, where he'd claimed the city was a dead canvas that needed to be reawakened. Suddenly, they had a potential face, not a ghost, but a man of flesh and blood. The address on file was an old tenement building just on the edge of the industrial district. As they drove towards it, the tension in the car was a living thing. This felt different. Harrington felt that old, familiar thrill of the hunt, the feeling that the chase was nearing its end. They didn't go in with sirens blazing. This man was meticulous, paranoid. A full frontal assault would send him scurrying into the shadows for good. Harrington and Claire, along with a small, plain-clothed team, set up a discreet perimeter. The building was a crumbling relic, its windows dark and empty like vacant eyes. From their position across the street, they watched. Hours bled into one another. The cold was relentless. Just after dusk, a light flickered on in a third-floor window. A silhouette moved behind the grimy glass. It was him. A near miss became an imminent capture. But then, as if sensing them, the light went out. A moment later, a figure emerged from the building's side entrance, moving quickly down an alley. He was just a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. But they knew. "He made us," Harrington hissed into his radio, starting the car. The pursuit was a tense, nerve-wracking crawl through the district's back streets, not a high-speed chase. Finch was on foot, and he knew the terrain, disappearing into the skeletal remains of old factories and rail yards. The team was closing in, but he was slippery. He seemed to anticipate their every move. The hunter had become the hunted, and he was reacting with the same cold precision he used to plan his murders. Then at a dead end, cornered against the graffiti-scarred wall of a defunct cannery, he stopped. He turned to face them as Harrington's car screeched to a halt, its headlights pinning him in their glare. He didn't run. He just stood there, a small, unassuming man with thinning hair and a strangely calm expression. He was holding a small, leather-bound book. As Harrington and the other officers exited the car, guns drawn, Finch opened the book and let a single page flutter to the ground. It was a page of poetry, left for them. It was a final, defiant signature. This wasn't just a capture. It was the end of a performance. And as Harrington looked into the placid, intelligent eyes of Alistair Finch, he realized the psychological game wasn't over. It was just moving to a new, more intimate stage. The interrogation room. The interrogation room was small, suffocating, and painted a color that was supposed to be calming but only seemed to amplify the tension. It smelled of stale fear. Alistair Finch sat at the metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was unnervingly still, a stark contrast to the storm of activity his capture had unleashed. He looked less like a monstrous killer and more like a librarian, which, Harrington reflected grimly, was what their third victim had been. Finch's calm was his armor, his final piece of performance art. He had refused to speak to anyone but Harrington, a detail that made the hairs on the detective's arms stand up. The game was now a duel. Harrington entered the room alone, leaving Claire and the others to watch from behind the two-way mirror. He sat opposite Finch, placing a folder on the table between them, but not opening it. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Harrington, the weary warrior, and Finch, the quiet architect of chaos. "Alistair," Harrington began, his voice level. "It's over." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Finch's lips. "Is it? An ending is simply a point from which a new perspective begins. Don't you think, Detective?" His voice was soft, educated, completely devoid of the madness they had expected. The interrogation was a grueling battle of wills. Finch deflected every question with philosophical musings and cryptic statements. He spoke of patterns, of beauty and decay, of the city as a canvas. He admitted nothing, but he didn't deny anything either. He was toying with Harrington, enjoying the intellectual dance. Harrington felt his old frustrations rising, the familiar anger of being outmaneuvered. He was about to fall back on his old tactics of intimidation when he caught Claire's eye through the mirror. He saw her shake her head almost imperceptibly. "Don't play his game," the gesture said. "Change the board." Harrington took a deep breath, pushing his chair back. He changed his approach. He stopped asking about the murders. Instead, he asked about Finch's art. He asked about the failed arts project, about the grant he never received, about the years of being ignored and dismissed by a world that didn't understand his vision. He spoke of Finch not as a killer but as a failed artist. For the first time, a crack appeared in Finch's serene facade, a flicker of anger, of wounded pride in his eyes. "They didn't see," Finch whispered, his voice tight. "They looked at my work and they saw only lines. They didn't see the anechoic perfection, the beauty of a closed system." This was the opening. Claire's voice suddenly crackled through the small earpiece Harrington wore, a feed they had set up before he went in. "The chess pieces, Mike. It's not a random assortment. A knight, a bishop, a rook, a queen. He's missing the king." Harrington leaned forward, his eyes locked on Finch's. "You made a world on our streets, Alistair. A perfect system. But every system needs a leader, a king. Where is the king?" Finch's composure finally shattered, his calm expression twisted into a snarl of rage. "You could never understand. The king is the final piece, the signature. It is the artist himself, sacrificing himself for his creation, to complete the work." It was a confession, wrapped in a manifesto. Finch proceeded to lay out the entire plan, not with remorse but with the triumphant pride of an artist explaining his masterpiece. He described how he chose his victims, how he created the patterns, how he drew the spiral across the city. He wanted the credit. He wanted his legacy secured. The case was closed. The media hailed Harrington and his team as heroes. Claire Donovan, the young analyst, was given a departmental commendation, her brilliance finally and publicly recognized. She had earned the respect she deserved, and in the process, she had taught an old dog like Harrington a new way to see the world. He had learned to trust again, not just in a partner, but in a new way of thinking. Weeks later, the city had moved on. The name Alistair Finch was relegated to the history of the city's monsters. One rainy evening, Harrington and Claire sat in a quiet downtown bar, a rare moment of peace. The victory felt strangely hollow. "It all fits," Harrington said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He confessed to everything. Every detail matched. "Almost everything," Claire said quietly, staring into her own drink. Harrington looked at her. "What do you mean, almost?" "The ink," she said. finally meeting his gaze. The ink he used for the spiral in the last victim's apartment. The chemical composition was slightly different. The supplier was the same, but it was from a different batch, manufactured a month earlier than the ink we found in his apartment. Harrington felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It was a tiny detail, an insignificant, explainable discrepancy, a loose thread. It could mean anything, Claire. He could have had an old pen. It means nothing. Probably, she agreed, though her eyes told a different story. But the pattern, Mike, the one thing he never ever deviated from was the pattern. He was perfect, meticulous. So why the different ink? Why the one tiny mistake? They sat in silence, the question hanging in the air between them. Alistair Finch was locked away. The city was safe. The police had their man. Justice, by all official accounts, had been served. But as Harrington stared out the window at the rain-slicked streets, he couldn't shake the feeling, the nagging doubt. They had a face. They had a confession. But the invisible enemy, the true nature of the perfect cold intelligence they had been chasing, still felt maddeningly out of reach. They had caught the artist, but Harrington would forever wonder if they had truly understood the art, or if the final, most important piece was still out there, lost in the shadows.